Hello and welcome to this Future in Review with Nigel Farage. Nigel, this week I thought instead of reviewing the news, I wanted to ask you the same question that I've asked our readers at Fortune and Freedom. So imagine it's 2035 and the government has realized that net zero is unattainable because we just don't have the resources for it, meaning the copper, the lithium, the cobalt, whatever it is. And governments have realized they're not going to be able to produce the amount of energy and to provide the grid needed and to provide the batteries needed and the cars and whatnot in order to make net zero work. What happens next? Do they decide to abandon net zero and destroy the planet and drown it in carbon emissions? Or do they decide to reduce our energy demands by way of climate lockdowns, by way of carbon rationing, and all the rest of it, that dystopian nightmare? Which of the two is it going to be?
Well, it's not going to be 2035. The realization that we cannot switch to electric vehicles in the United Kingdom over the course of the next decade, that realization is going to hit home pretty hard and pretty soon. It is literally impossible for some of the reasons that you've just outlined. I mean, for the whole of the Western world to go towards EVs, I mean, you would be talking about a mining revolution across the globe on a scale of which has never been seen and is probably unobtainable anyway. So it's interesting to see all the traditional car makers reducing output, profits disappearing, they're all in the doldrums. I've got a feeling at some point in time, traditional car makers could be a very good place to invest money. Maybe not yet, but at some point, because the realization is going to hit, we can't do this. Now, absolute dystopia, where we are rationed. I mean, back to wartime, wartime cards. Two interesting things happened this week. The first was a report that came out of the University of Leeds that basically said we need to head towards having individual carbon credits, and when you've used them up, you've used them up. They'd be non-tradable, as if a black market wouldn't exist. I mean, these people are, no wonder they're in universities and not in business. But then the big kicker came from Tony Blair. Tony Blair and William Hague. Now, you may have thought they were opponents in Parliament. They never were. Tweedledum and Tweedledee, just as it is today with Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. And they come out with a joint report with 40 recommendations for the data that should be on a digital identity card, a state-owned and run digital identity card. And on it would be everything from your mum and dad's name, your date of birth, your residence, your bank account details, your credit rating, your vaccination status, your tax status, your qualifications. I mean, literally everything about you would be on this digital ID card. And I can imagine sort of going to a restaurant, ID please. Oh no, I'm sorry, we can't give you a table. Your credit rating isn't really good. I mean, you can just imagine how this could be used. But this is how they get our carbon consumption. They link digital ID cards to their long-term goal of central bank digital currencies. And we are then living in a world where government has control of everything, where people can be criminalized because the law changes and they're suddenly not, Mr. Blair and his friends insist we must all get jabbed another 48 times and we don't want to do it or whatever it may be. So the idea that if you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't be frightened is clearly, in this instance, nonsense. And that is how rationing would be introduced. Now, whilst there's no doubt that the proponents of big government like Mr. Blair want this, and interestingly, he said 2 months ago, we'll need digital ID for all the jabs that we're going to need to have. I mean, what he knows that we don't know, I simply, can't get my head around it. But then you have to ask yourself, is it actually a possibility? Could they actually do this and get away with it? Now, I was very shocked as to how compliant the British population were with lockdown. Very, very shocked. I mean, mask mania particularly. I mean, all the evidence was that masks made little or no difference at all. And yet, a couple of times I was out and about shopping during lockdown, going to get the papers, stuff like that. And people sort of saying, "Oh my God, Mr. Farage, you're not wearing a mask," as if I committed some heinous act. So it does show that people can be manipulated, but I think we've learned a lesson from lockdown, and I think we're going to go on learning it over the next few years as we begin to understand that the health damage, the psychological damage, the business damage, the national debt damage that it did. So I think we're going to be more questioning about this. I don't think, however much they want to have a future in which we're rationed, I don't think politically they're going to get away with it. So what they'll do is they'll kick the can down the road, they'll push the dates for net zero back, they'll never admit they haven't achieved this goal. No, I could be wrong. You know, maybe they will get away with this. Maybe we are heading to a sort of Blairite, Orwellian, dystopian vision of the future. So I'm not saying this won't happen. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying that I think this would become the biggest political battleground that any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And so I'm hoping and praying that it doesn't happen, but I think we're going to have to fight very hard against it to succeed.
I want to dig into some of the points you've made in a bit more detail. The first one, reminding our readers that you were a London metals trader, so you understand this commodities issue quite well. How implausible is it that we're going to hit net zero with, you know, all the EV cars, improving the grid, the amount of copper we need, the amount of lithium, all these sorts of things? You gave the official line, the International Energy Agency line, which is that it's going to need an unprecedented commodities boom in production in order to bring this about. That's the official view, but how plausible is it that we can actually pull that off? Yeah, especially given the fact that the governments are the ones restraining mining at the moment for the very same reasons that we need the resources in order to make the green energy transition happen.
Well, there's the irony, isn't it? That actually the net zero lot don't want any mining of any kind at all. Oh dear, we need to mine cobalt, we need to mine lithium, we need to mine copper. So they're all at sea with this. Look, truth of it is that, you know, it'll be Africa and places like this where the real exploitation happens on the basis of out of sight, out of mind, I guess. You know, one thing I learned from a long time in the metals business was it's really easy to close a mine. You just close it. You do it a day. Sack everybody, move on. When it comes to opening up mineral resources, so many times the best laid plans of mice and men are pushed awry by geological faults, by all sorts of other problems, and theory and practice in mining are two very different things, which is why most people that buy stocks in mining exploration companies, frankly, do their conkers, because most of them fail because things go wrong. So it doesn't matter, you know, with a slide rule, what calculations you make as to if we do X, we'll get a result of Y. It rarely results in being that way. The sheer quantities of these commodities that would be needed to meet anything like these EV targets, even without thinking where the hell is all that electricity going to come from. We're living in a world where our leaders get together at G7 and G20, make these bold, grand proclamations, but rarely does anything really come of them in terms of achieving the objective. So look, I just think the whole thing is completely unrealistic. They'll try, and I've no doubt in the UK, we're going to build goodness knows how many wind turbines, etc. But the realities are, it cannot be done. The realities are, it won't be done. And maybe, just maybe, a political reality starts to come in, which is, well, if the rest of the world is burning 8 billion tons of coal in 2023, does it actually make any difference anyway? So I think this is one of those, great consensual political views that will be challenged, not tomorrow, but as we begin to approach these targets and these dates. I think you're going to start to get a much stronger counter narrative. It's very interesting. I mean, you know, even now, despite years of propaganda on these issues, when the British public are actually objectively polled on what they think about the costs that they as individuals are going to have to pay, you know, whether it's getting rid of a gas boiler and moving towards a heat pump, whether it's buying an EV, you start to dig down into the practicalities. And over 50% of the population, you know, give a very traditional British signal to it. So, you know, the fact there's a consensus amongst the political class and the media class, it doesn't mean we're going to continue down this route forever. We're not. This is all going to hit into reality. And I still believe that once people wake up to the fact that the only way they can do this is to effectively put us back on wartime rationing, to reduce our choices and our quality of life, whilst the rest of the world are going up in terms of wealth and in terms of how they live and what they do. I just don't think it can happen. But the dangers are there, and of course, the way they'll try to do it is little piece by little piece. The central bank digital currency comes in 2030, but only in a very small and reserved way. Interesting, I thought Jeremy Hunt last week said people would not be allowed to hoard central bank digital currencies. We used to call that saving. Where are these people going with all of this? It is quite astonishing. It is quite astonishing. We have lost a lot of our liberty in the most extraordinary way. In fact, the United Kingdom is now the most surveilled country outside China. There's a CCTV camera everywhere. And what it does, it turns ordinary folk into criminals. You're driving down the embankment in London at 2 o'clock in the morning at 23 miles an hour, you get a ticket. I feel there has to be a pushback against this. I just do.
I can tell you from reading the readers' emails that a lot of people have experienced what you said there about the cost of actually attempting to do all of this. Once people realize what it really means for them in their everyday life, that changes their opinion. We had about 170 emails, and a lot of them are along those lines. People have had bad experiences with green energy so far. But let's turn to the idea that if they stick with this goal and they start to try and restrain how much energy we use by way of climate lockdowns and carbon rationing and restraints on travel in these 15-minute cities, I noticed how when you present people with these ideas, they'll say, oh, they'll never do that. They would never lock us in our own houses. They would never constrain our travel. They would never force us to have passes in order to, and they would never do rationing. We just had all this 2.5 years ago. And they said that it would never happen.
And the other point to make about this is think what the effect would be on the economy. Think what the effect would be on gross domestic product. Think what the effect would be, particularly if we had a commodity boom, which may happen. We could be at the beginning of a commodity super cycle. I don't rule that out by any means. Just think of the decline in living standards that it would lead to. It would dwarf the decline in living standards that we've seen for many people over the course of the last few years. And it would be a proposition that we live that way on a permanent basis. I just have to believe that the political fight back against that would be absolutely enormous.
That's already started in a lot of places, which is sort of room for optimism. But it seems to me that the media and the political class are really pushing this quite hard. So I read an article, I think it was the top story in Australia's main news aggregation site, and it claimed that 15-minute cities and having to, pay to travel across different parts of town, all of that's just a conspiracy theory. It's not really happening. And then I read an article by a friend of mine who pointed out that it is all happening. It is all real. So there's a really quite a big, almost like a propaganda gap already out there, between what's really already happening and what they're saying they would never do to us. And that seems like a pretty poor political strategy to me. So what are they playing at then?
Well, there is this, God's gone. There's no more God. So you have to believe in something. And the climate has replaced God for an awful lot of people. And climate alarmism, is why upper middle class white girls called Jocasta, chain themselves to gantries over the M25 in tears, shrieking hysterically that the end of the world is coming. This is what climate alarmism has done. And whilst it may have infected many of our young people who've been through the wokest universities that mankind's ever seen, this is not the view of the broad general population. This is not the view of a silent majority whose voices have simply not been heard.